Okay, so it's been a while since I made a video, mainly just because I've been engaging with reading philosophy texts, and I've not really felt the need to make any videos, or I've not actually known exactly what to discuss. There's been a few things I've been contemplating for a while, but um, mainly been engaging with meta ethics and normative ethics, and trying to strengthen my knowledge in those areas. A little bit on philosophy of mind as well. But nonetheless, putting all that to the side, today I wanted to talk about a paper in which I read from a philosopher that goes by the name Akil Bilgrami. And effectively, I'll be presenting this slides that I've created. And it is a project in which I'm focusing primarily on the way in which Bilgrami is presenting Strawson's. Strawson wrote a paper, basically, P.F. Strawson, he goes by the name, in, I believe it was maybe the 80s or the 90s. He wrote a paper. May have been earlier than that, I have to fact check. But he wrote a paper by the name of Freedom and Resentment, and it is concerning philosophy of action, but he goes into talking about reactive attitudes and how reactive attitudes are the very things in which prevent us from losing this sort of very important form of agency and free will within our interpersonal relationships. And it has a lot of it carries over quite a considerable amount to moral philosophy, and this is the topic of today's session, effectively. So the the presentation basically just begins with saying that the key sort of theme is that cruelty is not going to be something that's created merely by our reaction to a state of affairs in the world. Our reaction can be an answer to cruelty that already exists in the world. Right? So this is what we're going to be focusing on. So if we click up to the next slide, the central question of this video is going to be asking, is cruelty in the world, or is it only in us, in our psychological states, in our reactive attitudes, in our sentimental faculties, or our likes and dislikes, our preferences, our emotions? That question decides whether morality is perception, something in which we perceive. To perceive something is for there to be something to be perceived. Or is it a projection? Is it some sort of internal reactive attitude? Again, a reaction is something that reacts to something in the world. But a projection would sound something more like some sort of desire or disvalue that we have internal to our psychological state that we're projecting outward onto the world. Or is it something in between the two? Is it some sort of relationality? So click over to the next. So this is the opening question. So this is what today we're going to be talking about primarily. So Akil Bilgrami finds a realist possibility in P.F. Strawson's famous paper. So Strawson is effectively saying that our moral attitudes cannot be eliminated. But Strawson is still locating value within human nature, something that's very internal to our cognitive states. Now, Bilgrami is saying that those attitudes express practical agency. When one is a practical agent, and this will go into it a bit more very shortly, but to be a practical agent is to respond to reasons in the world, to weigh up options with epistemic uncertainty, and consider disvalue and value in the world. Agency makes sense only if it answers to real reasons and values in the world. That's effectively what we're going to be saying. So now the movements carry the argument. Three movements carry the argument, rather. Number one is the participant stance, which is to say that reactive attitudes connect value with agency. Number two is that an argument is going to be an argument for value realism. This is to say that agency answers to reasons and values within the world, as I touched on before. And three, the wider lessons for naturalism. Science depends on norms it cannot simply erase. So it's going to also be tying over to the way that we actually apply scientific rules of application, and how these are dependent on our normative attitudes and values and disvalues as well. So number one is we're beginning with the participant stance. So this is going to be how Strawson moves from moral language to moral perception. So early Strawson, in his earlier writings, he went by the claim that moral language will simply not reduce. So irreducible language does not yet mean independent moral facts, just to keep that in mind as we go on. So we can consider something such as starving an animal is wrong, right? This is not something that can be simply translated into I dislike starving animals, right? This is a claim about the world, a descriptive claim about the world, and this is a claim about my psychological state, right? My lack of desire for this state of affairs in the world, right? So non-reduction, it's important to note, is not automatically a form of moral realism or value realism. Just to put that out there. So what is reduction? So if we consider what reduction is in regards to moral claims, the reductive move is effectively going to be translating moral claims into non-moral, natural, or psychological facts, right? So to say that X is wrong is translated into it's disapproved by us. We do not desire X in the world, right? And a reason is going to be a cause of a behavior, right? Our desires effectively are conduits that translate into reasons in the world, right? It's not that our desires are responding to reasons already existing in the world. Now, what this translation loses is that our attitudes can be morally mistaken. Causes explain movement and reasons justify action. Suffering can call for a response. Now, we can take, for example, imagine if we were to see a vulnerable, cognitively disabled individual, a moral patient, or a vulnerable animal as a moral patient. They're in a state of psychological distress. They are experiencing tremendous suffering. I can respond to that with indignation or loving attention and help this animal. Now, it's important to note that my response is going to be dictated by the kind of being and kind of agent that I am already existing in the world. I don't merely, in some doxastic sense, conjure up my disvalues or values or my desires and things in which I do not desire, right? I see this vulnerable individual, this vulnerable being, animal or otherwise, and it calls forth for a response, right? It makes a normative demand upon me, which is to say that I believe that I should do X because X has called forth for a response, right? It's my sentimental faculties have responded to an event in the world, which is the animal suffering, and the animal suffering cannot be made good simply by my sort of positive response towards it. So we have some sort of psychopath that's responding to the animal suffering with a sort of positive sentiment, right? It desires to see this animal or this cognitive disabled individual suffer. That does not make the suffering of the being good, right? Suffering is something that is experienced from the inside, phenomenologically, and both conceptually and experientially cannot just be merely translated into something good because I like it from a third person perspective. So yeah, suffering is something that calls forth for a response. That's going to be very relevant going forward. So we switch over now. The decisive shift is from sentence to attitudes. So in early ethical vocabulary, ethical vocabulary cannot be eliminated. So evaluative reactive attitudes cannot be eliminated. Right? We're already presupposing within the scientific field, for example, that certain rules of inference are better than others. We're assuming in our interpersonal relationships, not even assuming, but we're experiencing it from the inside. We're experiencing resentment, gratitude, indignation, forgiveness, and these are all conceptual. If we read them out here, these are conceptual representations linguistically of real phenomena and states of affairs that we experience in our interpersonal relationships. We know what it feels like to forgive someone for harming us. We know what it feels like to feel indignation for someone. We know what it feels like to feel gratitude for someone, resentment, and so forth. So evaluative reactive attitudes cannot be eliminated. They are intrinsic to our experience as agents in the world. So one person can be encountered in two ways. If we look at the objective stance, we can, maybe Nagel would explain this as the kind of view from above, right? This sort of detached perspective. We can look at what caused the behavior, right? Causal relations. This is very engaged with science, right? Science is in the business of studying causal relations and predictions and probabilities, and a person appears as something to predict, treat, or manage. Now, if we contrast that with the participant stance, this is the stance that we're all familiar with, the stance that is primary. What reasons did they understand this? This asks, and a person appears as someone answerable to reasons and facts and values and disvalues in the world. It's the most sort of intimate primary position to be in. So now we go on to P.F. Strawson's reactive attitudes, and we want to say that reactive attitudes do not merely judge agency, they enact agency. So when I resent someone for knowingly harming an animal, let's say, someone's harming some sort of, my neighbor is harming their dog in front of me, I treat them as capable of understanding a reason not to do it. And that reason can be indexed to the animal's well-being, right? For instance, value and agency arrive together. Okay, we can't necessarily disentangle them and just take this detached view on the world. If we do such, then we lose what it means to be a practical agent responding to reasons in the world. So we can now say that we can suspend participation but not abolish it. We can withdraw a particular reaction. Perhaps it was accidental. Perhaps I slipped and spilled coffee all over my partner. She can either respond with indignation or she can respond with forgivingness, right? Perhaps the person could not understand. Maybe she has good reason to think that I did so intentionally with malice, and perhaps the expectation was unfair. But this does not translate to remove necessarily X is going to remove trust, right? It's going to be contextual, right? Gratitude, blame, apology, and forgiveness and ordinary relationships disappear if we lose all of these essential reactive attitudes. They're intrinsic to our nature. So the framework is justified from within value itself. Why keep the participant stance? Because in doing so, if we abandon it, it would abandon things we already have reason to value. We have reason to value trustworthiness, right? It helps our relationships, our interpersonal relationships flourish. It helps build trust. It helps with communication. Friendships need trust, disappointment, gratitude and forgiveness. Compassion needs attention to suffering and need. All of these are, again, intrinsic to our relationships with one another in the world and animals. So Strawson locates value inside human nature. So the official Humean direction, if we're looking at this from a sort of very strong anti-realist, potentially cognitivist, but also this could probably aptly apply to non-cognitivism, projectivism. The sort of order of action is our sentiments, then comes value, then comes action. So our sentiments sort of conjure up this value, or we value X because our sentiment values X, right? I just have a desire for chopping up individuals or stealing or, etc. So it goes our sentiments, value, and then action. The mind is the source and site of value, right? So it's not to say necessarily that our sentiments are just existing in a vacuum, but our sentiments are primary. Which almost does sound very much so like sentiments are existing in primary because they're just something that our cognitive states conjure up in response to the world. But there would be a reason by which our sentiments conjure up this, a response. I would say they're a response to these reasons. When we say, a sort of central question to this is torturing vulnerable individuals bad because I disvalue it, or do I disvalue it because it is bad, right? It's kind of the central question, like a sort of quite a simple way of working out whether you're a realist or an anti-realist. So again, the mind is the source and the site of value. Bilgrami will turn this direction around. He's going to say that it's got the order of explanation backwards. So we go on now to the second part of this sort of introductory paper to... I'm very unprofessional because it's my first time doing this sort of slides, but the sort of central question, the name of this paper that I'm referring to is The Philosophical Possibilities of the Participant Stance by Akhil Bilgrami, if anyone wants to try and find it. An argument for realism about values. If practical agency is real, value cannot remain seated inside the mind. So we can take an exclamation, such as "I will help," can be an intention or a prediction. An intention would be pertaining to practical agency, again, the state in which is primary to us. I will help the fox. When I engage as an agent with the world and the disvalue I recognize in the fox's suffering, I respond to a reason indexed to the animal suffering, and my agency lights up, and I consider, what should I do? I relate to myself as an agent with interacting with the world in this relationality sense. Now, contrast that with prediction, or the objective sort of scientistic stance, right? Knowing myself, I will probably help. What will I do? I relate to myself as an object within the world. I'm detached from myself, effectively. I cease to be a practical agent responding to reasons in the world. So there's a central question here, which is, do we actually, in fact, lose practical agency when we take this just pure objective scientistic stance? So practical agency can occur inside thinking. One theoretical question comes down to, what should I believe given the evidence? Right? If I see a table in my room, I recognize that belief is also sort of bound up with a web of other beliefs, such as the table has 4 legs. The table is a sort of cyan blue in its color. The table has certain objects placed on top of it. You know, this belief is not simply existing in a vacuum, right? So answering the question is already to form the belief, right? I answer these questions of why I believe X, and X is made immediately present to me. Deciding what to do does not yet do it. Deciding what the evidence warrants normally enacts the believing. So if I can sort of break this down a little bit, because some of it is fairly depth. I have tried to break it down a little bit in these slides, but there's a sort of common approach in naturalistic reduction in ethics and epistemology. So this is all pertaining to beliefs and norms and values, that the sort of objective detached stance is all there really is, and simply everything boils down to desires, right? And these desires seemingly exist in a vacuum. These beliefs are things that I don't necessarily, it's not necessarily that I ought to believe X, but rather that I just simply do believe X. But of course, as the ways in which we experience the world as a practical agent, we do have reasons for believing X, right? X or Y. And the belief in Y is oftentimes related to my belief in X. There's this sort of interdependent relationship between different beliefs. And that's sort of getting into like holism a little bit, but I won't go too off topic here. So let's consider a thought experiment. So imagine that there's an event in which there is a storm, right? A detached description, an objective detached description of this storm would talk about causal relationships and things such as condensation, pressure, weather pressure, dark clouds, H2O. Now, the engaged perception as the practical agent, again, in contrast with the event, the objective detached description of the event, recognizes a threat, right? Now we can go on to someone is in an alleyway causing suffering to a cat by burning it. We can look at this in a scientific sense. We see combustion, we see mammalian tissue. But as an engaged practical agent with the world, responding to reasons, we see cruelty taking place at the very same place where the burning of the cat is happening. We can look at malnutrition. Someone is, losing weight through calorie restriction. Their body mass is decreasing. Their bone density is decreasing. We can see that in a detached perspective, but we can also see need as a practical agent. Now, there's no need necessarily just baked into this descriptive explanation, right? When you look at it from a clearly an objective stance. But it's important to note that someone that is a practical agent can look at this description and they can recognize that, okay, well, if someone is losing a vast amount of weight and their calories are being restricted, they can recognize that there is a value, evaluative properties there. But the evaluative properties are not simply there in the sentence as laid out bare as just purely descriptions. It's just important to note that that asymmetry there. So practical engagement, requires a world that can matter. A complete causal description can tell us what is happening, right? I can say that my books are now falling off my desk. My cat has just spilled over a glass of water and it's gone all over my expensive MacBook computer. but neither of those descriptions can by themselves tell us what calls for a response, right? They're a very thin sort of account of what's happening. They're not telling us about what should happen, right? This is, we can't necessarily just get an evaluative sort of we can't necessarily get a prescriptive ought from a purely descriptive state of affairs. So we can consider things like threat, cruelty, need, and desirability. When we apply some sort of evaluative description to a thin description, then we have reason to believe that calls forth a response. But again, some practical agent needs to engage with this. So now a little thought experiment that I came up with. We can consider a fox on the moor, a very vulnerable being that has her leg trapped. We can consider that before anyone sees her, there are features of reality indexed to her, her qualitative states and her responses to what's happening, even if she's not a practical agent. I mean, she experiences disvalue in the context of pain, in the context of fear, distress, frustrated attempts to escape the trap that's just clamping down on her foreleg. Did our reaction create the badness when someone comes along this moor and they see the fox? Did we conjure up this badness, or did we actually respond to the badness indexed to the fox? I guess that's something that I'll let you think about. So, another example. Now, I'm a vegan, so this is quite meaningful to me, but we can consider certain states of affairs in the world today in the way in which I have reason to believe that it's quite clear to me that animals are hidden behind products, particularly farm animals. And we can look at this in a descriptive sense. We see a dairy product when we're in a store, just selecting between different products to buy. Or we can consider a female mammal whose body and secretions are being used, who's being exploited sexually by the dairy industry. The language changes what comes into view. We start seeing this animal with an attentive gaze and recognizing through moral perception that this is a being whose existence within the world calls forth for a response if we actually perceive that disvalue or value. So another example of farm animals is pigs. They merely are reduced to logistics in this reductive sense. We're seeing them in terms of their weight and their capacity, what they can give to us, right? The time of their delivery, how much output we can get from the animal's weight, right? We start seeing them as purely logistics, food products, bacon, or we can look at a conscious individual, confined, frightened, and approaching its own death, right? We can look into the eye of this animal and see a moral patient, someone who has an experience of the world, who has a favorite spot to lay in the grass on a sunny day, who has a favorite food, who enjoys many of the rich experiences that life has to offer when they're actually given the opportunity, which is often never the case. So a description can hide or disclose value. So this looks like just merely a description from an objective standpoint, but we've already got evaluative content baked in there, right? We've got confinement, we've got to be frightened, to be approaching one's death. It's already assuming a lot of sort of normativity here, right? So moral perception is more than vocabulary. So the same sentence can be spoken from two stances. We can say something like, this hen cannot spread her wings. A detached measurement or recognition of a life being constrained. A value lies in how the situation is apprehended. So again, it's sort of touching on the evaluative state of affairs. So can desires alone explain practical agency? So unless someone, of course, if someone, and I think Bill Graham prefaces this, if someone simply wants to deny that we have practical agency, maybe some sort of very staunch, hardcore, incompatibilist who thinks that we do not respond to reasons in the world with epistemic uncertainty, and that we aren't some sort of causal agent that may nonetheless be metaphysically caused by prior interactions, yet we still yield enough force to causally bring about X and Y. Someone can just do away with that and say, we're not the cause of ourselves, we're not we're not responding to reasons in the world, we're almost being coerced by the will of nature itself, which I'm quite confused by. Someone can just disclose it at that, and this is probably not going to work in convincing them otherwise, but nor would they believe that they could do it otherwise in any meaningful sense. So can desires alone explain practical agency? I feel sympathy, which translates to I desire to help, which translates to I act. Why add desirability, cruelty, or need outside the mind? That's the central question that we're going to get into next. So to know your belief is to look outward. When we ask, say if I ask you now, do you believe that it is raining outside? And your curtains are closed. Perhaps you can hear very faint sort of noise of rain hitting upon the glass. You're normally going to look through the window, right? You're going to recognize the auditory sensations. Let's say maybe you can't even hear the rain, right? You're going to scan and assess the world, right? You do not search your mental interiors, right? You don't search your cognitive faculties of your mind for a small internal object called a belief, right? A belief is something that's not conjured up just in your cognitive states in a vacuum. It's something that is instantiated through your relational reactions to the world, right? So now we can tie this. We can now tie this to desires, right? We're not just going to talk about beliefs, right? We're going to talk about desires. So to know your desire, to consider what is desirable, we can ask something like, do you want this? Do you want the injured fox to be helped? Let's go back to the fox on the moor. This female fox with its leg trapped in the trap of its foreleg. You consider the fox. You consider the value of the fox. You consider its states of affairs in the world, her wound, her fear, whether help is possible, whether intervention would actually benefit her. You're not just considering. You're not looking inside yourself and saying, do I desire that? And whether that is the case, whether you're having this sort of introspective attitude, it's being instantiated by the things that you've recognized in the world. So desired by me is not the same as desirable. So X is desired by me says I observe a psychological state inside myself. The desire may push my body like another causal force. I'm being pushed. I'm almost like a puppet at my strings, just responding to these internal desires. And the movement happens through me. Now, to say that X just is desirable, period, it's a brute fact that X is desirable. I apprehend a feature of the world as giving me a reason. There's some sort of, value embedded within this object of the world, be that a being or a beautiful painting or something with aesthetic properties. My desire answers to that feature. I enact the response as an agent. You would have no reason to desire the sort of aestheticism of a painting at at an art gallery, or to disvalue the suffering of the fox if it weren't the case that there were certain properties being instantiated by those things. So, an argument for realism in plain language. So I'm going to try to break this down a little bit. So we can say that practical agency is real. Okay, if we accept that presupposition, which seems clear to me, that I respond to reasons in the world, I'm not just merely a puppet at its strings. And even if that is the case, even if I'm a agent in which is caused by prior, causal states of affairs, I am also myself a causal agent that brings about causal states of affairs. You can take the classic sort of Stoic compatibilist interpretation. You can either be a dog tied to a cart, being dragged along helplessly, looking at yourself from an objective standpoint of just being coerced, or you can stand on your hind legs and your forelegs, run forth and use the faculties in which you have. So the second premise, we could say that agency needs reasons, not merely causes, and we've touched on that prior. Now, number 3, reasons appear as features of the world. It's touching into the sort of value realism. And 4, we can answer them well or badly. And 5, so value cannot be sealed inside the mind. Right? It's not something that can just exist in a vacuum. There's a relationality here. So we can look at a normative demand and how it is not just a causal shove to do X. A cause explains what made a movement happen. And it works whether anyone understands it or not. It asks what happens, it's predictive again. Think of this sort of scientific objective standpoint again, and then a reason will think of index to the practical agency side of things. A reason can be recognized, ignored, or misunderstood. It justifies action. It does not merely push. We ask what should happen, right? There's nothing inside this causal scientific state of affairs that is asking what should or should not be the case, right? It is raining outside right now does not tell me whether or not it should be raining outside, for instance. Right? Whereas I'm a practical agent responding to reasons in the world. There's certain states of affairs that can happen. This fox should not be suffering. I recognize the value of the fox. Whereas just saying, in a scientific sense, this fox is experiencing X, Y, and Z. There are C fibers firing, there is a breakdown of mammalian tissue, etc. It doesn't tell us anything about what should be the case. It's devoid of normative content. So realism explains moral error. A person restrains an injured dog, let's say. I perceive cruelty and feel indignation towards that said state of affairs. So here again, the practical agency comes in. Then I learn they are preventing a spinal injury. So at first, the practical agency lights up and I see disvalue in the world. Then I learn they are preventing a spinal injury. So our practical agency can incorrectly respond to states of affairs in the world. It is open to sort of reassessment or, standards of correction, right? The feeling was real, but the perception was not warranted. So it's important to know that this realism is neither Platonic nor reductive. A Platonist would say that values exist abstractly, that they're sort of analogous to, the laws of logic, right? They exist in this sort of causally inert realm. And a reductive naturalist, such as, think of someone like Sam Harris or Peter Railton, two quite famous moral naturalists of the reductive kind, value is nothing but a physical or causal fact. Right? And it's something that can be understood epistemically, scientifically, and we can measure it, but it's reducible to something like well-being, right? It's reducible descriptively, but oftentimes they're sneaking in a lot of normative content without quite realizing it, as far as I can tell. So Bagrami's route is value is worldly, perceptible, and irreducibly normative. So you can think of morally thin and thick terms. Morally thin ones, for example, better or good, right, or bad or should. These are all normative. They're all concerning norms of they're all considering what we should or should not do. When we say that something is good or something is bad, we're saying it's good or bad in virtue of some thicker moral properties such as compassion in relation to goodness, or flourishing, or badness in relation to suffering, or indignation, or there's many ways that these can be understood, and you can't just strip them of their normative content without losing what it means to be a practical agent. So the P.F. Strawson's participant stance contains a latent realism. And this is sort of the central sort of goal of Bilgrami's paper that we're touching on here, is that he thinks that there is a kind of hidden moral realism in Strawson's earlier work on reactive attitudes. These reactive attitudes are intrinsic to our experiences of the world as practical agents, and we respond to reasons, we respond to indignation, we respond to suffering, and these are things that we don't respond to merely because we have a desire to, or because that we conjure them up, or because that we, for objectivity to go through, for moral realism to go through, we just need this sort of, this stance independent reason, which would be the value or disvalue, right? I disvalue X because it is disvaluable, and it's disvaluable to someone independent of my desires or preferences, right? The fox's suffering on the moor is not, its suffering is not made good by me, and I think that there's a lot of good ways to defend moral anti-realism. There's a lot of good ways to defend realism in my view, but I think that a mistake of a lot of anti-realists, non-cognitivists, is that they think that disagreement merely, it simply reveals the falsity of moral realism. And I just don't think that can follow that. Merely, even if it were the case that we all believed that, it was wrong to torture vulnerable individuals, it would not be the case. That would not be the thing in which reveals that it is the case, right? And that would just show universality. It wouldn't show, moral realism to be the case. So I think that's important to know. So resentment can be understood as a fallible perception of freedom, responsibility, and wrongness in another's action. So Strawson's order of action is attitude and then value. Whereas Bilgrami is reversing that and saying that there is value in the world, and then that value translates to a warranted attitude towards that value. The value instantiates the attitude, whereas Strawson had it that the attitude instantiates the value. So what are the wider implications? Why science cannot erase the values that make science possible. So this is where it gets quite interesting as well. So the reductive naturalists, think of someone like Sam Harris or Peter Railton, if you're familiar with them, makes one extra move. They want to say that natural science identifies real value properties. Therefore, only properties identified by natural science are real. The second claim does not follow from the first. This is just some sort of, if you can think about this, clearly it's quite a dogmatic assertion. Right, to say that, we can't necessarily measure in causal relations or from a scientific perspective normativity, for example. Therefore, it must be reducible just merely to description, just because that we can't, sort of discover or look through that lens, right, through the first person or practical agency lens, which is the very thing that they're using, ironically, to actually even infer the rules of inference for their scientific approach. So scientific conclusions come from normative practice, which is just what I was touching on. What does the evidence justify? Which explanation is better? Again, we're baking in normative language here. What should we investigate? Right? We're practical agents engaging with the world, considering the value that certain scientific approaches bring forth. Right? Evidence, justification, rationality, relevance. The practice comes from the conclusion it makes possible. So the result cannot kick away its own ladder. It cannot kick away the normative ladder. Norms of evidence and agency. So that is primary. We are an agent engaging with the world. What is primary is our agency, the way that we respond, the way that we experience the world. Then we have a practical agent that is going about measuring the world through scientific practice, relations, causes, and then we have scientific conclusions that are that are pumped out of that. Right. It makes if X makes Y possible, Y cannot simply be used to declare X unreal. So what's making this possible is our normative practices and agency. So A more sort of capacious metaphysics on this would be that if we consider molecules plus agency plus value plus reasons, science is not something that's demoted. Its practice and its conclusions are both taken seriously. The world is wider than the inventory produced by one detached stance upon it. Just because that we can't sort of there are features of the world that are sui generis. You think of someone that may just be looking at the world through some sort of abstract sense, or they're focusing primarily on abstracta, or they're focusing primarily on descriptions, and there are certain beautiful colors in the world. There are certain value properties that cannot be broken down purely in descriptive terminology. That's not to say that they just simply don't exist. It doesn't follow from the fact that my human mind, my human cognition recognizes the redness of the apple on my table or the beauty of the painting on my wall. Therefore, my mind is the thing that is conjuring up this beauty or this color. It can very much be perceiving something. To perceive is for there to be something to be perceived, is the central idea behind this, I think, to say. So we're coming towards the end here, but it's important to note that there's central things that there are certain things that the paper is not claiming to have finished, right? It's not a complete moral theory. It's just a sort of rough guide that does sort of point at some certain sort of cracks in P.F. Strawson's work, as much as his work is very impressive, and I myself enjoy his work on philosophy of action, and there's certain sort of internalist notions of moral theory, reactive attitudes, etc. But it does not settle from every form of relativism or error theory. It assumes here that normativity cannot be reduced, and it will not, again, this is touching on what I mentioned earlier, it will not persuade someone who eliminates agency itself, which, believe it or not, there are people that do that. So, coming to the end, the animal does not matter because we react because the animal already matters, and I think that's really important to my moral philosophy. And I think that's one reason that I would not necessarily want to give up moral realism, because it actually bleeds over into my normative ethics quite a considerable amount. The more I'm reading about moral phenomenology, Buddhist ethics, and sort of particularist, pluralistic virtue ethics. I appreciate anyone that tuned in. If you want to try and find these papers anywhere, I recommend looking up Akhil Bogrami's The Philosophical Possibilities of the Participant Stance, quite a recent paper, and P.F. Strawson's Ethical Intuitionism and Freedom and Resentment. The part that came from the beliefs and desires similarities comes from Gareth Evans, the sort of belief and desires complex. I appreciate everyone who watched this video, and if you enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up, and I'll probably be engaging with more videos like this in the near future. So thanks a lot.